My name is Alexis Grant. I'm 31 years old, and tonight my family is celebrating my brother's future while pretending mine doesn't exist. The champagne flutes are full, the music's soft, and the compliments come smoother than the wine. My mother calls it elegance. I call it selective blindness. They're gathered at the Grant family's favorite restaurant. Chrome, chandeliers, curated laughter, raising their glasses to Nathan, the pride of our legacy. Meanwhile, my law degree sits in a frame on the corner table, untouched, unnoticed. I brought it as a gift, a peace offering, or maybe just proof. But no one looks. My father is shaking hands with Nathan's campaign advisor. My mother is toasting to tradition. My name isn't spoken, not even once. I should have known. But some parts of you still hope, even when you've learned better. I step outside. The air smells like chlorine and lilac. I don't cry. I don't scream. I just press play on a voicemail from DC. A voice offering a spot on a federal investigative unit. Quiet work. Real work. The kind that doesn't need applause. That's when I make the decision. They don't see me? Fine. I'll become the kind of woman they'll have no choice but to reckon with. Not for revenge, but for clarity. And if you've ever had to disappear just to find yourself again, if you've ever had to succeed in silence because the people closest to you refuse to clap, then stay with me. Because this isn't a story about family. It's about what happens when the silence they gave you becomes the weapon they didn't see coming. The glass in my hand was warm. I hadn't touched it since it was poured. Some generic white wine handed to me by a server who couldn't even pronounce my last name correctly. The party hummed around me, laughter and string music blending into a nauseating blend of false warmth and perfectly arranged smiles. Every surface gleamed. Crystal, chrome, curated affection. It was exactly the kind of celebration my parents lived for. Glossy, extravagant, and meticulously constructed to erase discomfort. I stood by the corner table, almost blending into the mahogany paneling, watching them. Evelyn raised her glass, her voice floating over the chatter like a silk noose. To Nathan, the first true pride of the Grant family. My breath caught, just for a moment. Not because I was surprised. I wasn't. I'd known it would come, that phrase, rehearsed in her mirror smile. But it still sliced. My father nodded solemnly at her words, clinking his flute against hers. Gerald Grant, the ever-measured, ever-disappointed patriarch. His gray eyes scanned the crowd, then landed on me for a fleeting second, long enough to register that I was still here, still occupying oxygen. Then they moved on, as if even that acknowledgement might taint the celebration. I reached into my bag and pulled out the framed photo. My law school graduation, 2020. I had waited a year to hand it over, waited for the pandemic to end, for them to have time, for the moment to feel right. It never did. But I brought it tonight anyway. Hope, stupid, lingering thing. I crossed the room, heels silent on the carpeted floor. My father turned slightly when I approached, just enough to show polite awareness. "Dad," I said softly, holding out the photo. He blinked at it. 1 second. 2. Then, with a movement so slight it could have been mistaken for grace, he pushed the frame gently to the side of the table without looking at it. "I'm talking with Nathan's campaign advisor," he said, as if that explained everything. Maybe it did. I didn't respond. There wasn't space for words in that moment. Not his, not mine. I backed away like a shadow. I tried Evelyn next. "Mom," I started. She gave me a glance sharp enough to draw blood. "Alexis, it's Nathan's night. Don't make it about you." Her voice was polite, smooth, trained. But I heard the contempt underneath. "You've always had a flair for drama." I nodded, or something like a nod. Then I turned and walked away before the ache in my chest could swell into something that might spill out. The air outside was sharp with manicured lilacs and chlorine from the decorative pool. I found my car by instinct, got in without turning the engine on. Silence folded around me like a heavy coat. I reached into my coat pocket, pulled out my phone, and tapped play on a saved voicemail. A clipped female voice emerged. "There's still room on the investigation team, if you're ready. DC needs people who can work under pressure." It was from a federal supervisor. I'd gotten the message 2 days ago after filing an unremarkable report no one at the state level cared about. They'd noticed. I hadn't responded. In my other pocket, the envelope crackled. An apology letter I wrote to my father last fall. Never sent, never would. I stared at it for a long moment, then reached into the back seat and picked up the frame I'd retrieved as I exited the restaurant. My fingers fumbled with the lighter, the click echoing too loud in the quiet of the street. The photo curled quickly, the glass cracked under the heat, and ashes danced upward before collapsing into the damp grass in the backyard behind our family home. No one noticed. They were still toasting inside. I stood there, smoke brushing my face, watching the last remnants of that version of me disappear. If they won't see me, then I'll become someone they can't ignore. I left the ashes where they lay, like a grave I wouldn't mourn. My heels pressed into the soil, deliberate, as I walked away. That night, Alexis Grant disappeared. Lieutenant A. Grant was born. Turns out silence is also a clearance level. That was what I wrote in my first field report under the name Lieutenant A. Grant. Typed in size 11 Calibri, double-spaced, impersonal, no flair, no signature. Just a line that might pass for a joke if anyone in this division still remembered how to laugh. The dorm room they gave me in DC wasn't much larger than a walk-in closet. The ceiling tiles buzzed with fluorescent fatigue, and the mattress still wore plastic like it was afraid of being touched. But there was a whiteboard. That was all I needed. By 2022, it was my second brain. Handwritten notes, arrows, bank codes, shell companies, the kind of ugly web no one wants to see unless they're trying to unmake someone quietly. Rachel Connors. Her name had appeared in 5 internal files, 7 PAC donations, and 1 strangely worded bill proposal that somehow passed the Ethics Review Committee without a single hearing. The dots connected too easily. That always meant someone was trying to make it look clean. Justice doesn't always wear robes. That was what my supervisor, if you could call him that, had said once during our only face-to-face meeting. His words echoed in my head more than his voice ever had. He spoke in task assignments, not mentorship. When I asked about the whistleblower from 2021, Micah, a former agent who'd been dismissed for procedural breach, he changed the subject without blinking. But later that week, a file appeared in my inbox, MicahRedacted.pdf. It was blank, except for 1 sentence blacked out 6 times, and a timestamp, March 3rd, 2021. It was enough to remind me that someone was always watching. By early 2023, I was no longer stationed in DC. They reassigned me to Glenbrook, a town 3 hours outside Des Moines, right on the Nebraska border. Fewer cameras, more shadows. It was the kind of place where people forgot your name 5 seconds after you told them. I liked it there. In Glenbrook, I wasn't Alexis Grant. I wasn't even Lieutenant Grant most days. I was the anonymous intern who brought dry coffee to committee meetings, took notes, and silently slipped folders into the right hands. I drafted 3 policy memos that would make their way to the Westfall lobby by the end of spring. One of them would come back rewritten with Rachel Connors' fingerprints all over it. That was the one I traced. One evening, as I finished polishing a document flagged for federal internal alignment, I uploaded it under a generic name and walked away. But when I logged into our secure system the next morning, a new message sat in the inbox of the external intake address, a submission by a citizen of the Midwest. The attachment was my memo, word for word. No one should have had access to it, not yet. But someone had. My hands hovered over the keyboard, not in fear, but calculation. If someone was watching, they'd chosen to tip their hand. It meant they weren't just watching. They were answering. Later that week, I filed a false leave form and drove to the next county to hand-deliver paperwork for a non-existent interview. It was just an excuse to get out, to think. I walked the aisles of a dying grocery store, stared at rows of too bright cereal boxes, wondering which of them my brother would have liked as a kid. Probably the ones with gold on the box. I never let myself wonder how he was doing now. That was the rule. But some memories break rules just by existing. That night, back in Glenbrook, I found a cream envelope in my mailbox. No stamp. No name. No ink except for the embossed seal of the state. Inside was a single card, thick and expensive, with one line printed in perfect serif. Governor's Gala, May 28th. Dress to match your ambition. No sender, no signature. But I knew exactly who it was meant for. I used to dream of walking into a room where they had to acknowledge me. I just never thought it would be this one. The chandelier above me glittered like someone had frozen fireworks mid-combustion. Everything shimmered. Gold-threaded gowns, manicured laughter, wine swirling in stemmed glass. But I stood still. No name tag. No title. Just the low hum of a presence that didn't beg to be noticed. No letters this time. Just presence. I inhaled the cool, perfumed air of the landmark hotel and let it cut through me like glass. April 2024. Nearly 3 years since I left that party in Des Moines as Alexis Grant. I had returned in the name of no one, wearing black, with my hair pinned back like armor. No eyeliner, no jewelry, just the badge tucked in my inner pocket, bearing a name the guests here had never said aloud but had quoted in every budget review and reform bill for 2 years. They called me the scalpel in the dark. Or so the headlines had once suggested. But none of that mattered here. Tonight was the governor's gala for anonymous state reformers. The irony was almost elegant. I stayed near the marble pillars, surveying the crowd. Champagne glinted. Live cello music painted the air. And there, moving too fast for a room this slow, was Nathan. My brother. His smile still looked borrowed, as if he never quite earned it. He passed me, eyes grazing my face with a blink too long. Like, but probably not, he murmured to himself, already turning away. I didn't flinch. I had long stopped craving the spark of recognition. That flame had burned out in a backyard fire pit, alongside a photograph and a letter never sent. Rachel Connors came next, her heels clicking like threats across the floor. She was in deep emerald, her lipstick a little too sharp. She didn't speak, only squinted, tilting her head like someone trying to remember where she buried a mistake. I let her stare. Then came the hush. Governor Foy emerged through the double doors like he owned the very idea of presence. A man who didn't demand silence, but received it. As he crossed the room, his eyes didn't scan. They hunted. He stopped 3 feet from me, raised a hand slowly, deliberately. Lieutenant Grant? And just like that, every whisper, every fork, every breath in that ballroom fell quiet. Yes, Governor, I replied, my voice level and dry. The moment stretched, a violin string pulled taut. Then he laughed softly, as though someone had just revealed a private joke at the funeral of an enemy. I've read your language before, he said. Medicaid reform, wasn't it? Poetic and lethal. His words sliced cleaner than any accolade. I didn't reply. Across the room, I heard a glass shatter. My mother had dropped her flute. It wasn't the first time they ignored me. It was just the last time I let them. The headlines bled across every screen. Grainy images from the gala, names half redacted in admiration, and mine in bold. Lieutenant Alexis Grant, architect behind Iowa's reform blueprint. Some journalists whispered it. Others shouted. Either way, silence had lost its grip. At the Grant house, the silence returned, but in a different form. I sat alone in the sunroom, wrapped in the glow of mid-morning, when Evelyn's message arrived. A simple text. Dinner tonight. Just us. To clarify. As if clarification was the balm for decades of dismissal. I didn't reply. Instead, I spent the afternoon by the garden I once buried apology drafts in. The grass had grown over all of it, but I still knew where each piece lay. Somewhere beneath the rosemary bush was the version of me who still wanted her father's approval. The bell rang. I didn't need to check. The knock that followed was rushed, uneven. Nathan. When I opened the door, his face was a wreck of mixed intentions, eyebrows drawn in apology, mouth twitching in panic. He held nothing, not even flowers, just excuses. I came to say sorry, he began, stepping in before I said anything. About everything. The party, the photo. God, Alexis, I didn't know it was you. I walked to the kitchen, pouring water like the moment was casual. And now that you do? I just... His voice cracked. Look, I know you're on that team. The investigative one. There's something coming. You need to know, it's not what it looks like. Which part? I asked, sliding a manila envelope across the counter. He looked at it like it might bite. Hesitated, then opened it. Inside was a financial summary, stamped and time-logged. His signature stared back at him, below a page confirming Westfall Media's direct fund transfers to Rachel Connor's PAC. I didn't know what I was signing. He whispered. You signed 10 pages. I was told it was compliance, Rachel said. She's protecting herself. You were always just a name she could borrow. He flinched. I've forgiven you, Nathan, I said quietly, folding my arms. But that doesn't mean I'll protect you. His breath hitched. He looked like he wanted to speak, maybe even beg, but the moment crumbled when his phone buzzed. He stepped outside, trembling fingers gripping the device. From the hallway, I heard her voice. Sharp, metallic, every word sliding through the cracks in our family like acid. If she brings this public, I'll bury both of you first. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room isn't the one speaking. It's the one being listened to. The governor's office didn't echo. It absorbed. Pale yellow light spilled across the polished floor like something sacred, but the silence pressed in like wet fabric. Heavy, clinging. I sat across from him, spine straight, hands folded. The envelope he had left on the table lay unopened between us. He didn't speak right away, just leaned back in his chair, observing, not evaluating, not calculating, just seeing. It's clean in here, I finally said. Governor Foy smiled faintly. Glass walls tend to invite cleaner behavior. You never know who's watching. I didn't reach for the folder yet. Instead, I studied the man who had called me by rank in a ballroom full of liars. He hadn't bowed, hadn't whispered. He had acknowledged. He tapped the folder lightly. That's the next bill Rachel Connors is pushing. Medicaid again. Same knife, duller sheath. I opened it. It was all there. Insertions marked in green, deletions in red. A line buried on page 6 rerouted discretionary funds. Another, on page 9, quietly expanded public-private partnerships in a way that would funnel millions back to Westfall. You already know, I said, closing the folder. Why am I here? To ask what you want written next, he said. You've been behind the curtain long enough. I don't do spotlights. He shrugged. You don't need to, but your name needs to be where the damage can't erase it again. I looked at the draft again, this time not with suspicion, but habit. I grabbed the fountain pen beside it and corrected line 7, removed a modifier on page 4, clarified a clause that had been intentionally vague. There, I said. That's policy, not theater. Foy watched me finish the last stroke like someone watching a chess piece move toward endgame. You do realize this makes it official, he said. No more lieutenant initials, just Alexis Grant, the name they all forgot to remember. My chest tightened. For a moment, my fingers hovered over the signature line. I thought of Lena, her voicemail from last night, breathless. Give it to me, Alexis. Let me print it. The people deserve truth, not posturing. I thought of Micah, the silence after his final message. I understand why you're doing this, he'd said. Just don't vanish so far you forget how to return. I signed. Alexis M. Grant, Senior Legislative Advisor. Temporary. The pen clicked back into place. Governor Foy slid the folder back into his briefcase, his movements as quiet as the decision itself. Then he looked at me, not with sympathy, but with clarity. "Expect cameras," he said, standing, "and enemies." They said I failed. That's funny. I'm the one who got the final edit. The morning sun hit the glass walls of the state building like applause. Outside, news vans clustered like moths. Inside, a podium stood waiting, center stage for the final shift. No fanfare, just facts, and a reckoning long overdue. I stood behind the governor. This time, no pseudonyms, no initials, just Alexis M. Grant, State Counsel. The badge clipped to my blazer was temporary, but the weight it carried was not. "They rewrote policy," the governor said, voice level, each word as deliberate as a scalpel. "We are here to correct the record and hold those responsible accountable." Rachel Connors wasn't in the room. She was already being followed. At the Grant house, they were watching too. My father leaned against the mantel, arms crossed. Evelyn sat stiffly on the edge of the couch. The TV's glow lit her face like confession. Between them, silence stretched long and bitter. Then Nathan appeared on the screen. "I assisted Westfall Media in shielding illegal PS activity. I enabled Rachel Connors. I believed it was loyalty. I see now it was cowardice." He paused, eyes glassy. "I have submitted all communications, including messages and recorded calls, to the investigation team." It didn't feel like vindication. It felt like a chapter ending, quietly. Then the broadcast cut to the front of Westfall headquarters. Rachel emerged flanked by 2 security guards. She walked briskly until the flashing red and blue lights stopped her cold. The arresting officer read the charges: embezzlement, PAC manipulation, threats against a federal witness. As they cuffed her, she lifted her eyes, found me in the camera lens. "You were never gone, were you?" she asked, her voice rasping over the noise. I didn't move. "You just never looked close enough." Later that night, I stood on the rooftop of the office building. The wind was sharp but clean, like breath after too long underwater. Micah stepped beside me. No words, just presence. He didn't ask for explanations. Didn't need them. He'd always understood what it meant to choose the dark so someone else could stand in the light. His hand touched my shoulder. "So, Lieutenant, what now?" I smiled, not bitter, not triumphant. Just free. Now I live. I didn't expect silence to be the loudest thing in the room that day. After everything, after the files, the press, the handcuffs snapping around Rachel Connors' wrists, I thought I would feel something more cinematic. Vindication, maybe. Triumph. Or at least a surge of satisfaction strong enough to drown out the memories. But instead, it was just quiet. The cameras flicked off. The crowd dispersed. The governor nodded once, respectful but final. The podium where I stood moments before now stood alone under the fading lights. And I, Alexis M. Grant, lieutenant no longer hiding behind acronyms, felt like I had finally stepped out of a shadow I didn't even know I'd lived in for so long. Back on the rooftop, Micah hadn't said much. He never needed to. His presence had always been more truth than anything words could offer. We stood side by side watching Des Moines blink beneath us. Lights, motion, noise. But up here, it was still. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was earned. It reminded me of the framed photo I burned 3 years ago, the one I handed my father and watched him push aside. That moment had branded itself into me like the heat from the fire. For a long time, I thought that pain would define me forever. I thought if I ever made it to this point, it would be about proving something to them, making them eat their words, choke on their champagne toasts, finally see me. But standing here, I realized I didn't want their recognition. I didn't even want their regret. Because the truth is, their approval was never the prize. Their absence carved the space I filled with my own voice. And their silence? It gave me room to rise louder than I ever could if they'd clapped politely and said, "We're proud." Nathan's apology on national television had surprised me. Not because he said it. I always knew he could say the right thing when cornered. But because this time, it almost felt like he meant it. Almost. Maybe it wasn't for me. Maybe it was for himself. Either way, I didn't need it. And my mother, well, Evelyn hadn't spoken to me since the gala. Not once. But I saw her face on the screen that day. Saw the shock, the calculation, the quiet horror when she realized the daughter she had dismissed was now the woman her colleagues were quoting in policy rooms. That was enough. Not as revenge, but as reality. I didn't take the position the governor offered. Senior legislative advisor was tempting, but it wasn't where my fire pointed anymore. That seat had someone else's name on it. A name that needed headlines and proximity to power. Mine belonged elsewhere. Instead, I opened a foundation. Micah helped with the paperwork. Lena helped spread the word. We named it the Firelight Initiative. For those who dared to speak when silence was safer. For those whose truths were buried beneath convenience and control. Now, every week, a new envelope arrives. An anonymous tip, a terrified whistleblower, a name they tried to erase. And I sit at my desk, no longer invisible, no longer waiting for someone else to do what needs doing. They said I failed, that I was too emotional, too headstrong, too much. But it turns out, that's exactly what it took. She was never the kind of failure they could contain, and in trying to silence her, they built the stage she eventually stood on. Justice didn't come with parades or perfect endings. It arrived through grit, refusal, and the quiet persistence of someone who no longer asked for permission to matter. In the end, it wasn't revenge that defined her. It was the clarity to know that power doesn't mean becoming what broke you. Because no wall of lies can stand forever against the tide of truth. And sometimes, the most courageous act is not exposing the guilty, but choosing to live fully despite them. If you're still here, watching, listening, feeling every breath between these sentences, thank you. Not just for finishing this story, but for being the kind of person who stays until the truth finishes speaking. I know this wasn't easy to hear. Some stories don't come with neat endings. Some victories don't look like applause. They look like quiet resolve, tired hands, and names finally spoken aloud after years of being left off the guest list. If you've ever been the one left out of the photo, the one whose dreams didn't fit the family mold, the one they called too much, too emotional, or simply inconvenient, then this story was always yours too. I didn't write this for revenge. I wrote it for anyone who's ever stood in the shadows and decided to stop waiting for permission to matter. Because you don't need their approval. You don't need their apology. And you certainly don't need to explain your worth to the very people who made you question it. What you need, what we all need, is to remember this. Silence isn't weakness. It's just the space before the voice returns. Stronger, sharper, unapologetic. So if this resonated with you, if you've ever had to rebuild yourself from the ground up while they kept raising glasses to someone else, leave me a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me what they said you couldn't do, and how you're doing it anyway. Because this space, this channel, isn't just for stories. It's for the survivors of dismissal. The ones who stayed quiet long enough and are ready to rewrite the ending on their own terms. Like this video if it gave voice to something you've carried too long in silence. Share it with someone you know is still learning how to speak again, on their own terms, in their own time. And if you haven't yet, subscribe. Not just to follow more stories like Alexis Grant's, but to remind yourself that you are not alone in this. To every viewer who has been here since the beginning, to every comment, every share, every quiet nod behind a screen, thank you. You've built this space with me, and together we're proving something important. That even in a world that tries to mute us, our stories still rise. Until next time, keep building, keep speaking, and remember, the most powerful truth is the one you no longer need anyone else to validate.